everybody. So we have a brilliant speaker tonight, Jim Downs, Professor Jim Downs, who I'm going to tell you a little bit about the introduction to in a second. I just want to say thanks for coming. I'm Dr. Laura Sandy, and I'm the co-director for the Centre for the Study of International Slavery, and we have regular events, but I'm pleased to say this is a collaborative event between different organisations and centres at the university. So we work with the International Slavery Museum. This is also in collaboration with the History Department, and of course our great Centre for Medical, Health, Medical and Environmental Studies. So thanks everyone who's contributed, and I especially want to thank Mary Booth with the organisation, Kira and Stephen Kenny for taking part. So just a little bit, and I don't want to waste too much time talking about you. I looked at your CV, it was so long. It was so long. It was wonderful. I was like, oh my God, how am I going to boil this down? It was brilliant. And I've known of Jim for a long time. We even met on a phone call. He didn't know I was listening. When I was put on speakerphone in a car at a conference in Alabama. We never met in person, and COVID has sort of prevented that. So at the moment, Professor Jim Downs is the Gilder Lehrman National Endowment for the Humanities Professor of Civil War Era Studies and History at Gettysburg College. But at the moment, so currently, and on his travels, he's on a research fellowship, the Sheila Biddle Ford Foundation Fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. Now you've got an exhaustive list of places you've worked, so I just picked some of the recent ones: Connecticut College, Princeton and Harvard Universities. And Jim's had many, many, many awards, like the National Endowment for the Humanities, many from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, Gilder Lehrman Institute, the New York Historical Society, Penn Women's Center, the Huntington Library, Duke and Yale, Goodwin Nearing Center for the Conservation of Biology and Environmental Studies, and many, many other things. He's published, and I like to pull out people's popular publications first, in a sense. I'm not going to read out all the 400 journal articles and book chapters that Jim has, so when you find him so wonderful this evening, you've got a lot to read over the coming years. But he's published in the New Yorker, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, Time Magazine, Vice, Slate, the Lancet, LA Times, and many, many others. He's the editor of Civil War History Journal, and he has been on radio, TV, and media appearances, doing commentary and interviews, and taking part about a variety of issues, and done this internationally. I actually, because I'm that boring, counted how many different organisations you've done this for in your last two books, for your last two books, for example, and it was over 50. I was a little dismayed to see the Daily Mail in there, but you've got to educate everyone. Then what else I found out today when I couldn't get my train because it was delayed, and Jim and I have been talking about our train dramas. We had a quick coffee when we just met for the first time in person. And I found this picture, and I was like, wow, Jim is like an American karaoke singer too, because underneath it just said, "Stand by me." So I was really excited about this, and I thought, oh, we're going to have a good time. But no, it's because he does groundbreaking research on all sorts of areas of history. Research about the marginalised. So actually, he was giving a talk for C-SPAN. He wasn't actually doing a karaoke performance. Those guys in the background weren't about to stand up. And he wrote a brilliant book, his book before the one he's going to talk about this evening, called Stand By Me, The Forgotten History of Gay Liberation. He's also written a book in 2012, or it came out in 2012, called Sick from Freedom, African American Sickness and Suffering During the Civil War and Reconstruction. So, as if that isn't exhaustive enough, Jim's done many, many edited collections. And you can look at these, you can go and buy them, or you can read them, get them from the library, but this is beyond the field of simply academic research. Jim is both a historian, but someone who writes about contemporary politics, for example, January the 6th, that we all know about, racial justice and activism. So again, some of the brilliant stuff he's done. But what do the people say about him? So, because again, I'm so nosy, I asked some of his friends and colleagues, what do you think of Jim? Hoping they'd say something very juicy. So this is what they said. I'm a big fan of Jim Downs' work, having met him over 2 decades ago. His globalization of Southern and West Indian topics has been heroic. Innovative research concerning racial ideology and scientific thought, whether writing on the legacy of public health in relation to Hurricane Katrina, for History Today, or LGBT issues within time, his output and range is impressive. So brilliant. I was a bit disappointed by the lack of gossip in there, but as you can see, Jim is an amazing man. So to wrap up and get us on to the book that he's talking about today, this is what the reviewers said, and they're harder to please than your colleagues and your friends sometimes. That one of the main reviews that came out by Deirdre Cooper Owens and others, said that this book that Jim's about to talk about is a game-changing book. Maladies of Empire has a captivating writing style, is exhaustively researched, and is persuasive in argumentation. Jim Downs has written a game-changing book. In this brilliant and timely book, Jim Downs uncovers the origins of epidemiology, slavery, colonialism, and war, a most original global history. This book is required reading for historians, medical researchers, and really anyone interested in the origins of modern medicine. So, Maladies of Empire, of course, is going to be translated into many languages because it's such a brilliant production from Jim. So, you can buy it on the Slavery Centre website or on Amazon, but I'm going to hand you over to Jim to tell you all about it so you can make up your own mind. So, thanks. Let's have a round of applause for Jim Downs.
I've never had a slideshow presentation to introduce me before, so that was quite in the US, they have these things called roast, where they sort of make fun of people, and it's like an introduction, so I didn't know, it was sort of oscillating between like major praise and what felt like a roast, so I'm but thank you, and I was taking pictures to show my mom. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take an element of Maladies of Empire, and I'm going to explain it under the trope of race, racism, and the origins of epidemiology, and then I'm happy to use the time during the Q&A to answer any questions. Before I begin, thank you so much to Laura. Thank you to all of the institutes that have provided the funding for me to be here. I'm super excited to be here to present my work. I was invited by Stephen Kinney in 2009 as part of another consortium very long ago to do earlier research, which eventually became one of the books, Connections, The Histories of Race and Sex. So I've been to Liverpool before. It was a really exciting and invigorating experience, so I'm thrilled to be back and to present to you today. So thank you for having me. So what I want to talk about is essentially how slavery, colonialism, and war created brand new built environments that allowed doctors to study the spread of infectious disease. And in their creation of these new methods, it led to the development of epidemiology as a field of study. Most people will say, after hearing me say something like this, well, doctors have been studying epidemics since Aristotle. Absolutely. People will say also slavery's been around for a very long time. Absolutely. But what I noticed was in the 1750s, it was the confluence of the growth of the British Empire, the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade, and later the Crimean War and the American Civil War that actually led to the development of epidemiology as a field of study. And to define epidemiology, I would just do it very basically. That epidemiology is a branch of medicine that studies the control, prevention, and of infectious disease, and also how disease spreads. So what I began to notice was that when these doctors, beginning in the 1750s down into the 1860s, were trying to understand the spread of disease, they developed a number of methods that eventually became the hallmark of epidemiology as a field of study. So while doctors may have studied disease in Venice in the 14th century, or they may have studied the outbreak of an epidemic in the 19th century Ottoman Empire, what you begin to see between 1750 and 1866 is how the confluence of slavery, colonialism, and war create a massive bureaucracy. And that massive bureaucracy provides a type of record and an archival trail that actually leads to the development of epidemiology as a field. And so that doctors who may have worked in Venice or in the Ottoman Empire, they were often singular or potentially isolated. What happens with war in the transatlantic slave trade is it creates a network through the bureaucracy of the slave trade that provides doctors with the opportunity to learn about infection in other places, test their theories about how to prevent the spread of disease, and also discuss methods for control. And all of this is anchored through mostly the British military, and then it's adopted later by the US and by other countries. I did research in Spain and other parts of the world to see if there was a different pattern, but what I noticed was that the beginning of the field of epidemiology is traced to the British Empire, largely because when these doctors returned from their voyages, whether on a slave ship or on a colonial plantation, they arrived back to London, and in 1850 they created the first ever epidemiological society. So the notion of an epidemiological society first originates in the UK, and then it develops in other places. So when I'm talking about what did they actually do, how were they able to create a new branch of medical science? If you look at their records, which are housed at the Wellcome Institute, as also at the National Archives of Kew, and you read about how they understood cholera or smallpox or plague, you would soon recognize that most of their ideas and theories about the actual cause and transmission of disease are wrong. This is during a period before the bacteriological revolution, before the understanding of virus, before the understanding of how microbiology can help us understand epidemics. So many historians have dismissed them because they were actually postulating incorrect theories. So what I did was sort of step back and say, I'm not interested necessarily in how you think cholera spreads, or I'm not actually interested in you thinking about how to prevent what you think actually leads to the prevention of smallpox. I'm more interested in the types of methods that develop, which then become the hallmark of epidemiology. So I want to just focus on a couple of different pieces here, and I'm going to play it out within various historical episodes throughout the talk. But I want to think about sanitation, surveillance, data collection, interviews, contact tracing, maps, and then I want to talk about the dependence on subjugated populations. So first, sanitation. As late as the 18th century or even earlier, doctors began to sort of think about how unsanitary environments led to the spread of infection. Prior to that, they believed that epidemics were a result of supernatural forces, a result of God or some other force in nature. There were also circulating at this time ideas about miasma. But mostly the ways in which doctors tried to prevent the spread of disease was through implementing various measures to clean up the environment. But oftentimes these were unsuccessful, and oftentimes they didn't work. But what it did do was create a bureaucracy that allowed doctors to both trade information and sort of learn from each other. The second is surveillance. We begin to sort of see, especially through colonialism, the ways in which the military developed various methods to observe people throughout the empire. These methods of observation become key hallmarks in the development of epidemiology, which I'll explain later. Data collection. Most of the sort of bureaucracy involved in colonialism is about collecting information about places. So yesterday, for example, I was at the British Public Library and I was looking at the records of a fever hospital in Calcutta. It was a 300-page report in which doctors are basically just collecting data about transmission, collecting data about prevention, talking about the state of health conditions in that area. In terms of understanding what they think is intermittent fever or yellow fever, all of that's incorrect, but the idea of doctors writing reports and sending it to a central administrative unit, and a person at that central administrative unit then gaining a bird's eye view is part of how the field of epidemiology begins to develop. Contact tracing, I'm going to give an example of that in a second, in West Africa. But what we begin to sort of see in the 1760s down into 1850 is that when doctors are deployed on slave ships or in colonial plantations, or even in battlefield hospitals like Florence Nightingale in Crimea, it's not enough to just treat patients, but it's also to begin the process of contact tracing, to figure out where the origin of this disease happened. Again, did examples like this happen in the early modern world? Possibly, But what happens in the 1750s, aided by British Empire, is the creation of a bureaucracy that captures those moments, that leads to doctors' observations being documented, recorded, and circulated. And so contact tracing as a key methodology develops as part of colonialism, and I'll give that example later. Maps are crucial to colonial endeavors, and the maps that we actually use to understand how empires operate become major technologies in understanding the spread of infectious disease. When COVID first broke out, I was sort of stunned to sort of think about the ways in which we have in many ways adopted methods and ideas from colonial doctors. And journalists would say, well, what have we learned from the past that can help guide us in the future? And one of them is maps. We took for granted this idea of trying to trace COVID from Wuhan to Iran to Italy to New York. That notion of mapping, that particular technology to understand the transmission of disease felt really natural, felt really obvious. But in many ways, it's a consequence of colonialism. The notion of using maps to track disease began in colonial empires and then got adopted by the metropole and by British officials. So we can sort of see the genealogy of mapping as a key method in understanding COVID today to how it actually developed during colonial endeavors, which I'll explain in a minute. But then the most important piece of all is the dependent on subjugated populations. When I realized through looking at the records in the British Archives, in the British Public Library, and at the Wellcome Institute, and I saw doctors deployed throughout the empire or on transatlantic slave ships, or even in battlefield hospitals, I saw them thinking about how to understand the spread of infection, about how to control it, and how to stop it. But in each case, there was a variation because colonialism is obviously very different from slavery, which is very different from war. But I noticed the common denominator, that there was often an oppressed, subjugated population that helped make the disease more visible to the colonial authority. And so when I started this research, it wasn't just about expanding our understanding of medical knowledge to say it's not just doctors in the metropole, it's doctors scattered throughout the British Empire. It was rather to think about the role that patients play in helping to make epidemics visible and the ways in which patients help to create new forms of knowledge production. So that's the sort of overarching outline, which will become clearer once I give this sort of examples. So I'm going to step back a little farther in time, just in historiographical time, to talk about race and medicine. So when we sort of think about this question of what does it mean to study race and medicine, at least within the context of the United States, it normally falls into one of these categories. It's either the question of experimentation, which we've seen with doctors in the American South experimenting on enslaved women's bodies and then later on Irish women's bodies in New York in order to develop new understandings of gynecology. This is an image meant to represent J. Marion Sims. It's meant in experimentation here in the case of the syphilis study in Tuskegee, where the federal government deploys doctors to a poor area in Alabama where they want to witness secondary and tertiary syphilis, and they withhold treatment in order to see how it manifests on the bodies of poor black men. And then it's a more recent case which is discovered about Henrietta Lacks and the ways in which her cells help to advance knowledge of cancer and other issues. That's the main way we sort of think about experimentation within the broader field of race and medicine. There's also a second way of thinking about it, and that is, how does race and medicine help to lead to new understandings, or how does understandings of how do understandings of medicine help to lead to new understandings of race? So that there is in fact an argument about biological difference. And how do doctors from the 18th century to the 19th century provide proof of black people as a separate race by pointing to their health conditions? And this is the argument of Rana Hogarth's work, Medicalizing Blackness. There's a huge discourse when we talk about race and medicine about how this relationship helps to codify ideological understandings of identity. So that's another way of thinking about this field. And then more recently, or somewhat more recently, it was established by Keith Wailoo early in his study of black people and sickle cell. But what he's really doing here is thinking about how various contexts make disease visible. So why and how does something like sickle cell get identified with black people? It's not about experimentation, and it's not about the codification of identity. It's rather how all of a sudden funding into medical research all of a sudden makes this a visible problem. Or how concerns about black people as a separate race now kind of lead to this understanding that they suffer from a particular disease. So ultimately, this is where the field is. What I wanted to do in my book was something separate, was to step outside of that model and offer a different one. There are elements of experimentation, there are elements of race as ideology, there are elements of how frameworks make disease visible, but what I was interested is thinking about, from a global perspective, how could we think about slavery, colonialism, and war, three entities that are often separate from each other in the literature. How can we think about them as together, and how can we sort of understand the ways in which various power dynamics had made people available to study? And what I noticed was that in all of these conditions, we begin to sort of see how slavery leads to the construction of a built environment, the slave ship. How colonialism leads to the construction of a built environment, a plantation. How war leads to the construction of a built environment, the battlefield. It's within those brand new social settings that we begin to see how doctors develop new understandings of medicine. So typically, when people talk about the origin of epidemiology, they don't say epidemiology originated on a slave ship. They don't say new ideas about epidemiology originated in colonialism or in the battlefield. Instead, they say that ideas about epidemiology can be traced to John Snow. So the traditional story of John Snow is that he's an anesthesiologist who wants to understand why and how cholera is affecting a poor population in London. So he goes into the neighborhood and investigates it, and soon realizes, without me getting into the entire story, that the epidemic can be traced to a water pump. Because what he's noticed is that when he begins the investigation, he'll knock on someone's door and he'll realize that 2 or 3 people will be infected within the household. The next door, no one will be affected. The house next to that, 5 people might be affected, and then it'll skip over to another house. At that particular time, there's 2 prevailing medical understandings. One is sanitation, so clearly the use of sanitation or disuse of sanitation is not helping him understand why and how cholera is spreading. And then the second theory is contagion. But if in fact cholera was contagious, then everyone in a particular household would be sick, or it wouldn't have skipped over. But what he begins to do is to develop an investigative method that through a process of deduction, he realizes it's traced to a water pump. Essentially, he does post-mortem evaluations of the body, and he noticed that the GI tract has been compromised. At the time, people thought that disease traveled as a result of miasma, that as a result of trash or decomposed vegetables, what you would have is an odor that would emanate from that. The odor would spread in the air, and then people would become sick. But he looked at their lungs and he saw none of their lungs are compromised, their stomachs are. And so he soon theorized that it was a result of what they were drinking and the water pump. So that becomes the sort of major story. There's a bar in London where you can sort of see he's sort of recognized as the father of epidemiology. And he's often praised as the sole pioneer in the creation of epidemiology. And so when I came to London to learn more about him, and I went to the Wellcome Institute, and I talked to an archivist, and she said, you really should go to the British Archives instead. And I thought, well, wait, I want to know the history of medicine, and I want to know more about Snow. I want to study physicians. And she suggested that I go to the National Archives at Kew, because there were records of doctors who were already involved in investigations of cholera and other infectious diseases. What I soon realized is that there's a missing link within our understanding of the history of epidemiology. That doctors deployed throughout the British Empire on slave ships and in colonial plantations and war saw disease. They observed its various manifestations. They theorized about how it spread. They tried to develop methods to stop it. But because they were employed by the military, they were forced to write down their observations. They were forced to document their various forms of prevention. They were compelled to sort of talk to other doctors about what they saw. And when they returned home, they felt as if this experience had provided them with a type of expertise. And so they created the London Epidemiological Society. So the first thing I realized was that Snow was not a sole pioneer, but he was actually a member of an organization of a group of doctors who had been studying the spread of infection all around the world. And it wasn't just that they were studying disease in Malta or in the west coast of Africa or in Jamaica or in India. They were studying subjugated, often oppressed populations and learning about disease from these people, learning about both methods of prevention and even cure. And when they returned home, they created a new sense, a new idea of how to respond to epidemics. So at first I thought, okay, this book project is casting not just Snow as a key member, but it's casting a whole score of other doctors who we've often overlooked. But I also wanted to pay attention to who these people on the ground were, and to pay attention to the fact that they were often in situations that were organized by oppressive forces, okay? So one of the people that I started to look at was a guy by the name of McWilliam. And what happened was, in 1846, there was a British vessel that was dispatched from London to police the coast of Sierra Leone for any sign of the illegal slave trafficking. And so they arrive in Sierra Leone, they don't find any signs of slave trafficking, and so they're forced to return home. On their voyage home, they go to Cape Verde. And they're sort of frustrated at this point because there was a huge monetary award if they were able to actually catch slavers, and they didn't. So they go to the island and they party, they have like a really good time, they get drunk, 3 guys go missing, we still don't know what happened to them. It's a sort of like tragic, that part of the story is somewhat tragic. But what begins to happen is that once they're on the ship, as they're coming back to London, they start exhibiting signs, presenting signs of infection, of what we later think is yellow fever, but they sort of only call it fever. When the ship gets close to London, it sparks a huge debate over quarantine. And government officials start to mandate that they are not allowed to disembark because they may, in fact, spread this fever to the English people. Merchants start claiming they should absolutely be allowed to come in, because if word gets out that this ship is in fact contagious, no one's going to want to trade with London. Other merchants respond and say, No, exactly the opposite. We should keep them in quarantine because of the fact that if word gets out that we knew there was an infection and we didn't do anything, no one would want to trade with us. So it became this huge debate. Meanwhile, the soldiers are sort of stuck in quarantine, is something which I think an audience in 2022 can understand. An audience in 2012 probably had no idea. So they were stuck in quarantine for all of this time, and there's this mysterious outbreak, and they don't know what to do. It's in the British press, it's debated by people in government. And so they take this guy by the name of McWilliam, who had served on an expedition to Africa before, and they send him to Cape Verde, which are the islands that are basically on the outskirts of West Africa. And they say, go down and investigate what happened. So he goes down to Cape Verde, and he begins this massive investigation to understand the spread of fever. What he does is he meets the washerwomen, because they had the most direct contact with men on the ship because they were cleaning their soiled linens. He interviews them about the disease, what they saw, about the incubation period, about the symptoms, about where it actually spread. These washerwomen had no idea that 2 or 3 months after an epidemic erupted on their island, that someone would come and ask them questions. And yet they remembered where the virus went, or where the disease went, from one hut to the next, from one part of the island to another. They took notice of the fact that the vomit was black, which was the hallmark of yellow fever. They provided him with different theories on the incubation period. What he eventually puts together is a 150-page manuscript, which is featured right here, and it includes a verbatim transcript of all of the washerwomen, enslaved people, and colonized people on the island who had contact with yellow fever. So now I need to step outside of the story and tell you a little bit about the research method. In 2014, I returned to the Wellcome Institute to do research, and I had already done a lot at the British National Archives, and as many of you know, you go into the manuscripts room, you fill out your slips of what you want to see, and then they say to you, come back in 2 or 3 hours. I was jet lagged, I had just arrived from the US, I wanted to go downstairs to the cafe where they have a pretty decent chocolate cake, maybe a latte, hang out. But instead I decided I'm gonna walk around the open stacks. And I walked around the open stacks and I found an anthology, a book that had a number of different pamphlets in it. And in one of the pamphlets, I found this document. And in it, I was shocked because what I found was representations of people of color, both enslaved and colonized, both named their first name and their last name, and then even a reference to their racial category. So this is 19th century nomenclature. You'll see she's referred to as a mulatto, a native of San Antonio. That's not Texas, that's instead Cape Verde. And then questions. Do you know who washed the clothes? They were when they came to your house. Do you know who came for it? It's just this entire inventory of what happened, where was it, and what she remembered. I had been studying the intersection of race and medicine by that point for 14 to 15 years. Most of the records that I used were records by doctors, and what I would have to do is to try to find clues or fragments to uncover the subjectivity of Black people. I had never seen in over 15 years a document that actually provided proof of what people of color were saying about an epidemic. It's a completely rare find. And so what I realized was, why was the value of how the interviews provided a key metric in understanding epidemics, but also the ways in which these people provided the doctor with an understanding about the epidemic that he eventually brought back to to London. I'm going to go back to the research method. This is 2014. The book doesn't come out until 2021. I go on to work on other parts of the book. I then realize that a leading historian of medicine, not to mention any names, a person at Oxford, Stephen, do you want to guess? Mark Harrison publishes a book. He's an amazing, distinguished historian, and he's really interested in this episode. He came across the same records, and yet his interpretation of those records was all about the quarantine debate and the various sides and the protagonists and the arguments in the quarantine debate. It was not about the actual people. So the question becomes, how can two historians working on the same exact topic actually derive a completely different conclusions? One, Harrison, very smart, very distinguished, very important book, looks at it from a top-down approach, which is how the government and medical authorities respond to quarantine. What does this mean for contagion? As someone who was trained in African American studies and in literary studies, I was trained to look for subjugated voices. I was trained to look for people who appear in the margins of major canonical literary text, and to flip the script and to sort of tell their story as a leading protagonist. So what does that mean for the slide behind me? Beginning in the 1970s, leading up to the present, there have been within literature departments groups of Black feminist scholars who are trying to excavate the stories of Black women and Black people in major canonical texts, from Shakespeare's Othello to Faulkner. And what they were doing is sort of Toni Morrison was doing in her book, this is not her fiction, her nonfiction work, was trying to come up with a method or a strategy to recover people who in major canonical stories, traditional stories, only appear as an ellipse, only appear on the margins. And to actually flip the script and say, what does the story of Othello look like when we tell it from the vantage point of the people of color? And then you have in the 1970s, we talk about intersectionality. This is a common term that gets deployed frequently in cultural debates. It arrives really in the 1970s with Black feminists who are searching for a language to describe their experience. And they say things like, all of the men are brave. I mean, all of the men are Black, which means that in the civil rights movement, in the Black Power movement, the men were the leading actors. All of the women are white, which meant that in the feminist movement, the white women dominated, but some of us are brave. So they were in search of a language, of a vocabulary to talk about their own identity. And then finally, there's other work by Hazel Carby about reconstructing and finding people in literature and how you develop various strategies. So I took all of this, I had been trained in this tradition as an undergraduate and then later as a graduate student. So when I look at a document like this, I look at it from the vantage point of this sort of skill set that these scholars have put forward. And so for me, the action was not just in what government authorities or physicians were saying about quarantine. It was actually about who the minor characters in this story were. A woman who appears as a native in only a paragraph. How can she help us understand this epidemic? So we talk about interdisciplinarity all the time, but what does interdisciplinarity mean? And what I was doing was using the skills of literature as a way of reading medical text to flip the script and to learn more about the creation of epidemiology. So what we begin to sort of see is that in the study of Boya Vista, based on the descriptions that these women gave, McWilliam develops a whole new map that reconstructs the region where the ship was and where the people were in order to understand the spread of fever. And yet, what we remember through both popular lore and even through public history is that it's Snow's map of the Broad Street pump that becomes the leading hallmark for epidemiology. What we haven't seen was that McWilliam was actually part of the same organization as Snow, and that McWilliam actually was in conversation with people like Snow and other doctors throughout the British Empire that provided Snow with the methods to understand the spread of infection. So, I've already sort of done this. I want to turn to a sort of popular sort of example, which is the Brooks slave ship. So, the Epidemiological Society gets founded in 1850. So as a historian, would you say that the field of epidemiology began in 1850? Instead, I realized this is when the doctors came together to formally create the organization. What is the antecedent? Where can we actually see an earlier sort of development of ideas? And what I noticed was that beginning with the transatlantic slave trade, we begin to sort of see the rise of epidemiological thinking. And so this is an iconic image that has been sort of deployed throughout many textbooks. It's used by abolitionists in order to sort of show the harrowing conditions of enslaved Africans on the brutal transport from Africa to the New World. But this also becomes a potent illustration in order to explain the need for ventilation and also to codify the new understanding of oxygen as a key scientific element. So let me just, again, sort of back up a little bit and explain the research process. I was looking at issues of the Lancet at the end of the 19th century, and when doctors were talking about the significance of ventilation in tenement buildings and the need for ventilation in crowded environments. And in order for them to explain why fresh air is important, they actually mentioned Trotter, a doctor by the name of Thomas Trotter. And so I went down to a major sort of, I went through what is called like a rabbit hole of like trying to figure out more about Thomas Trotter. It turns out that Thomas Trotter was assigned on the Brooks ship. And when he arrives onto the ship, he goes to the bottom of it, and he realizes how the people are placed in densely crowded conditions. And he notices that many of them begin to sort of suffocate just from being in a confined space. He then also notes that the enslaved Africans should be brought up to the top deck where they're allowed to, quote, dance, and they're allowed to exercise and to get fresh air, but this was deprived of them. So Trotter goes back to England, uses this information in order to help support the abolitionist movement. But scientists at the time take this information in order to help solidify the notion of oxygen as a key element. Beginning in the 1750s, chemistry as a field begins to develop as a key real science. It was often dismissed as this sort of the work of court jesters. It was called alchemy. But in the 1750s, you have scientists in England, France, and Germany who are using a device called a trough, and they're trying to examine how air changes its quality in a confined space. Now, people since Aristotle understood that air was necessary for human survival, but the advent of chemistry as a scientific field begins to study how does air change in certain environments. And so within laboratories, scientists throughout Europe are making the claim that air can change in a particular way, in a particular setting. But Trotter provides the proof of what happens to human survival when people are crowded in a particular area and the ways in which air changes its composition. And so what we begin to sort of see through Trotter's observation is the extent to which air becomes compromised as a result of enslaved Africans at the bottom of slave ships. I have stuff here on scurvy. I don't know how much time I have. I'm okay? All right, I can come back to it. I want to just stick with air, and then I'm going to come back to scurvy because I'm losing my breath. Okay. I wanted to know more about this, and Stephen Hales is recognized as a leading chemist, and he's someone who develops the first ventilators. If you're a historian of science, oftentimes what you would read is his most published work, because his most published and his most refined work is often what actually leads to his theory that he's known for. But in actuality, Stephen Hales published 2 or 3 other treatises. And in these documents, he's looking at the ways in which ventilators on slave ships actually change the quality of the air. So if you just Google Stephen Hales and you Google ventilators, you're not going to find the word slavery. But you would need to go back to his earlier treatise. And in his earlier treatise, he begins to sort of show various experiments that are placed on ships in which slave captains implement ventilators and then report back to him the ways in which enslaved Africans then say that their breathing is better as a result. They become they unwittingly endorse the use of ventilators. They advertise the use of ventilators by explaining its utility. But also, more importantly, a lot of these captains begin to report the mortality rate as decreasing. So, and one of them, it's from Liverpool. In order to provide the need for ventilators, he draws on evidence from slave ships. I was informed that in a Liverpool ship which had ventilators, not one of the 800 slaves died, he writes, except only a child born in the voyage. He further added that in several other ships without ventilators, there died 30, 40, 50, or 60 in a ship. Hales also included a letter from a French doctor in his 1758 treatise who claimed that ventilators on ships decreased the mortality rate from 1/4 of those valuable cargoes in the long passage from Africa to the French plantations. So what we begin to sort of see here is something really important. When we talk about why is slavery necessary for our understanding, we often say it's important to reckon with history, to set the record straight. But then we often think of science as this pristine, lily-white type of enterprise that has not at all been affected by slavery. And that the only recovery work that we have to do for slavery is in the service of literature or in the service of history. And yet, as this example shows, a key element like oxygen and a key technological development like ventilators trace their genealogy to the institution of slavery. And so that it's the experience of enslaved Africans describing how they felt relieved and the fact that their mortality rates decreased that we begin to see the implementation of a brand new scientific innovation. So that within circles today of scholars, we often talk about how did slavery contribute to understandings of capitalism and how did it affect the economy. But this provides persuasive evidence of how slavery was really useful in the construction of new scientific ideas and in the development of new technologies like the ventilator. And more importantly, that oxygen, that you may remember from your days studying chemistry, which appears on a periodic table, arrives on that periodic table in direct result of the slave trade and the ways in which doctors' epidemiological investigations help to create new scientific ideas. This is the 1756 treatise where the word slaves is mentioned, and it's really important to see how it's just, I mean, rhetorically, again, as someone who, I earned my undergraduate degree in English, so I'm always thinking about how language is deployed and doing a close reading, and the ways in which slaves appears alongside of passengers and cattle, other perishable commodities, that this also signals to how people in the scientific world were looking at slave ships, not just in terms of transporting commodities, but also to develop new medical knowledge. And then finally, you see, here's the final draft of Hale's document, and there's no reference to the word slavery. So there's also a way in which slavery gets scrubbed clean from the scientific record. It could appear here in the 56 treatise, but in the more sort of widely recognized treatise, it's no longer there. And then we just see the word ships. Now, this is an interesting question to sort of ponder, and I don't have the answer. But when people said ships in the 18th century, did they assume slave ships, or did they just think passenger ships or commodities? I don't know. But it seems to me that it's less of him purposely erasing the word slaves from his treatise, although he could have been influenced by abolitionist sentiment, and more just, I think, just a rhetorical practice. Again, I don't have the answer for that, but it's just necessary to think about when you do investigations into the study of slavery, that the simple keyword searches might not produce the answers that you're looking for. And then just want to jump back in time, maybe you're swirling back and forth from the 1750s to the 1850s, but this is just to give a sort of clearer example of how this works out, so that throughout the 1750s, throughout the 1760s, 1770s, and 80s, Trotter might become the iconic example of a doctor whose epidemiological thinking changes the ways that a lot of people at the time understand science and medicine. But the next generation is a doctor by the name of Gavin Milroy, and Gavin Milroy is a contemporary of Snow, but Snow has sort of overshadowed him as a sort of leading person. Milroy becomes the president of the Epidemiological Society, and when cholera breaks out in Jamaica in 1850, the British Crown dispatches him to Jamaica in order to understand it. At this particular time, Snow has a theory that cholera transmission can be traced to water, but many doctors, including Milroy, don't necessarily buy it. So Milroy begins his own massive investigation. I'll save you a lot of time by just saying all of his theories prove to be inevitably wrong, but what he does is he develops a key method that helps to accelerate epidemiology as a field. So while he's stationed in Kingston, he's able to collect reports from other doctors throughout Jamaica, but also throughout most of the British Caribbean. He also collects reports from doctors in Cuba and the US South. What you then begin to see is how military bureaucracy provides him with a bird's eye view of the outbreak of cholera across the Caribbean and then even through the southern part of the United States. This is an unprecedented innovation. He collects that material, sends it back to an administrative structure in the British metropole in London that begins to process it. So we now have a more systematic way of responding to epidemics. Prior to that, 19th century Ottoman Empire, 13th century Venice, epidemics broke out, but doctors often didn't have the type of networks that colonialism provided them. As I say this, I can even hear the tone of my voice. It could sound a bit sanguine. Are you saying that this is a good thing? No, I'm trying to sort of uncover the ways in which colonialism created a bureaucracy that helped to track the spread of disease. It's absolutely necessary to recognize that all of this is only possible as